Good afternoon. My name is Katie Stahl, and thank you for attending our second Tuesday webinar this month. For April, we are looking to spring into color quality control with more really valuable information pertaining to the 5 C's of color management. So just a quick synopsis of what you're going to hear today. Dave will be presenting and reviewing the first C of the 5 C's of color control, color management, and that is capturing the data. And then he's going to progress to the second C, which is all about the precision and accuracy, or the consistency in calibrating your devices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave. And please feel free to answer or ask any questions. We want to provide the answer as we go. Make it interactive if you would. And also there will be a link in the chat box for you to please fill out the questionnaire pertaining to your value that you found in this session and what you would like to see in future sessions. So with that, I will turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Katie. So as Katie said, we're continuing part 2 in the demystifying color. And today we're focused on the second C. Since last month we talked about the first C. I'll do a little bit of review on the first C, but this month is all about the second C of the 5 C's of color management and color control. Like we did last week, we'll talk about some new concepts and terms and definitions. And one of the key definitions that we need to establish is, how do you quantify color differences? Especially when we're talking about the same printer, how it's printing from, let's say, Monday to Tuesday or Tuesday to Wednesday. We need to be able to quantify the color difference in how a printer is printing the same print on multiple days of the week. So we'll go through that. And as I mentioned, we'll do a little review of the first C, which is capturing your data. Then we'll go into the second C, which is calibrating your devices to make sure they're consistent. And then we'll do some demonstration and give you an access to some trial software so you can somehow I got muted here, so let me unmute myself. All right, so now we'll go to the second C, and here's the 5 C's. So the first C is capturing your data. Second C is calibrating to make your printer and other devices consistent to themselves over time. The third C is characterizing your printing device, which is another word for creating an ICC profile that defines the gamut of your device. Once you understand how each of your devices render color based on the profiles you built for each device, then you do a color conversion, which is the 4th C, to convert the color to your prints. And then the most important C is the conformance C, which is checking your results at every step of the way to make sure the results are meeting your expectations for a color match. And as we talked about last month, in terms of capturing your data, you need to understand what that data means. And we'll talk about this a lot today with the calibration, to know how often should you recalibrate your devices to make sure these are consistent to one another. And as we get rolling into the presentation, I want to reinforce what Katie said. Please ask any questions in the chat. We've got a couple people looking at the chat, and we'll try to answer the questions as we go through. So when we're quantifying color differences, if you're not capturing data, you have no idea what's happening. So it's critical that you capture the data with some sort of measurement device, which there's all sorts of shapes and sizes of measurement devices on the market, as I'm showing you some of them here. And the choice of which measurement device you choose will be based on not only your need, but also your price point and your quality requirements, which comes down to the conformance to your production standard. does this meet your expectations in terms of a color match? And by establishing your production standard, you can begin to determine what is sellable print versus waste. When is a print suitable to sell to a customer versus not suitable to sell to a customer, and ideally catch it before you print 1,000 sheets of this print so that you don't have to come back later and take customer complaints and maybe give them a full credit on the print job. So it's all about understanding sellable versus waste. And here's an actual example from a project I did with Clemson University. This was a Clemson advertisement to get students to want to come to Clemson. And we blindly sent this to 3 different printers, the exact same file, and you can see the variation of the results. And you could say one's a proof, one's a press, and one's digital. It really doesn't matter. If you're a printer and you have one printer and you never do repeat work, that printer can really print any way, any day. It doesn't really matter the color that's coming off of it. I mean, it does, but I'll take my color badge off for the second. So just say, you'll probably get away with it because there's nothing to compare the color to. But if you're printing repetitive jobs for the same customer, or if you're printing the same job on multiple output devices, that's where there's going to be the ability to visually compare the difference. And if your devices are not lined up within the customer's expectations, you could lose money on these jobs, which you don't want to do. So defining what is waste is the key part of this. And in order to define what waste is, we have to be able to quantify what color differences are. And there's a couple different ways to quantify color differences. When we're talking about specific brand colors, like this Ritz box, this Ritz red is a known red. It's a brand color. And Ritz has a specification for how close, if you're printing Ritz work, how close the red has to be. And we use one type of metric to define that, as opposed to the difference between the pages or images. So let's say I take a second Ritz box and I want to compare what's the difference between these 2 pages to one another. So it's more process color comparison. That's a second metric we're going to learn about. And the first metric that we use when we're defining specific brand colors is a metric called delta E. And typically the delta E 2000 equation, which is the ISO standard for almost all industries today. And with the delta E 2000, the larger the number, the larger the visual difference to your eye. And in this way, it's the difference between 2 colors. Now, when we're talking about page color difference, so we're looking at all the colors on the page, this is where we need a metric to define the process color differences. And this is where E factor comes in. And E factor is a type of delta E. It's actually the 95th percentile delta E, which encompasses all the colors within the page and gives you a very good metric to help you understand how different the pages are from one another. And just like delta E, the bigger the number, the bigger the difference. And it correlates really well with delta E on individual colors because it is based on delta E. So if we look at my sample here, if you look at the colors, like if you look at the beige color in the middle, there's a 5 delta E difference between the top and the bottom color. You look at the green, it's a bigger difference, and you can see it is a 7 delta E difference. And so in this way, delta E is a great metric to define the difference between 2 colors. But now, if you look at the 3 images below, these are all G7 compliant images, but they're still visually different from one another. And E factor allows us to quantify the difference. So you can see the difference between the 2 images on the left. It's a smaller visual difference than the 2 images on the right. And hence, the E factor of the 2 images on the left is about a 3, and the images, the differences on the right are 6. So in this way, we can now quantify how close 2 prints are to one another, how close the printer was printing this morning versus this afternoon, how close my printer is printing to my proof, or how close my printer is printing to an industry reference like Brackle. These are all things that we can now quantify using our E-factor metrics. And we can also quantify what a person's expectations are for a color match. And this becomes really important so that we can quantify what's waste and what is not waste. So essentially, the technical definition of E-factor is the 95th percentile. And ideally, you need at least 60 patch values within your color bar to be able to derive an accurate E-factor. And if you have this, which almost all color bars do, then you can have a really good sense of how close any 2 prints are to one another. So we like to know if the print is sellable, and it's really like defining the sidelines on a athletic field. You have to know what's inbounds and out of bounds. And today, it's been pretty much tribal knowledge in terms of doing work for a customer and deciding whether or not that customer is going to accept it. And once you start working with a customer a lot and you see what they like and what they won't like, you start to know, oh, this person's picky or this person isn't. This is all what we call tribal knowledge, which is all about crossing your fingers and hoping that the color that you create for them will meet their needs or meet their expectations. And this provides a large risk for loss, which we don't want to lose money. We don't want to lose customers. So this is where having E-factor comes in, because E-factor is twofold. Number one, E-factor can be used to quantify the difference in prints. But number two, it can be used to quantify a customer's expectations before they even give you money for the job or ask you to do a job. And what we found in our scientific research, which we've published over the last 6 years, is that an E-factor of 3 or less, you're almost always safe. An E-factor of a 5, it's kind of a 50-50 chance, depending upon the print buyer, how picky or non-picky they are. When you start getting to an E-factor of an 8, pretty much no one's going to accept that if they're looking, if they're paying attention. They're not going to like it. So this now gives us a really good indication of how well our printers are matching to one another based on everybody's expectations or typical people who buy print, what their expectations are. And it really helps us set the in play versus out of bounds to determine whether or not what I'm printing is reasonable. Now, in order to measure color, we have to have a measurement device. And it's interesting, measurement devices can be quantified in E-factor as well. The more accurate a measurement device is, the less E-factor it will have, meaning the more precise it measures color, more consistent, more accurate. The instrument on the left is a $50 color muse. It's not very accurate compared to other instruments on the market, but it's $50. 2.9 E-factor, which relates to a delta E. Whereas an i1 Pro is more like a 0.7. That's an i1 Pro 2. An i1 Pro 3 is more like a 0.1. Actually more like a 0.2. It's more similar to an exact. And then an exact's like 0.25. So every instrument we can quantify in this E-factor, which helps define whether or not the device is suitable for the type of work you want to do. And this also helps you understand that if you dropped your instrument once too many times, and maybe my i1's now a 1.5, I shouldn't be using that i1 to measure color. It's crazy to me how people use these measurement instruments every day to measure color. And if you're not checking the instrument, you don't know how precise your instrument is versus how it should be measuring. And that's a problem. We need to know that our instruments are measuring right. And that's part of the process of getting complete color control over your environment. And that's something that we help you do. So as we talk about the calibration aspect of color management, it's all about consistency, because without consistency, you're not going to match color. When we teach G7 courses to become a G7 expert, and everyone out there who's gone through a G7 expert class, you know, we say stabilize the process. But unfortunately, we don't really tell you how you should stabilize the process. And that's what we're going to tell you today, is we're going to tell you how you can print the same print over multiple days in a row and compare it using E-factor to understand how much the device is varying. And in this way, you can build calibration schedules to stay on top of your devices to make sure that they're meeting your expectations. And sometimes all you need to do is calibrate. I've got an example I'm going to share with you that I'm actually baselining a new printing device that I've never worked with before. And I've got now 7 days of data collected on this device, and it's calibrated once a day. It's never been profiled, and the results are fantastic. And I'll show you that. And in this case, for the way this customer is using that device, they don't need to profile it. The calibration is good enough. And we'll show you that as we get into the presentation. So when we're talking about calibration, it's the act of implementing process control. And the key is ensuring that the device is predictable, stable, and consistently operates at a target level of performance with only normal variation. Okay, what is a target level of performance? Well, it depends upon your expectations. You've got people out there that are trying to maintain color to a very tight tolerance, like the Ritz box. And then you've got people that are doing a spaghetti dinner fundraising brochure that doesn't need nearly the tightness of precision as a Ritz box. So this is where the definition of target level of performance and normal variation, people get lost here because they're like, well, how do I define the target level of performance? How do I measure what normal variation is? That's what this session's all about. So with that, how often should you calibrate? Well, it really depends upon your expectations for sellability. The tighter the expectations, the more often a device should typically be calibrated. Understand, the more often it's calibrated, the more time and effort it takes. Less production, more downtime, costs more money. As you increase your quality, you decrease your throughput. So you don't want to have too good of quality that your customers can't appreciate it, because then you're losing money. But in the same sense, you don't want too loose of quality, because then you lose customers because it's not good enough for them. So it's a fine balance to figure out the expectations for sellability. And every shop has a different type of clientele that they're already working with. For instance, Shutterfly is a big customer of ours, and everything they do on every one of their presses is within a 3E factor of a color match. And as you learned earlier, virtually everyone will accept a 3E factor. So no matter if you had something printed in Berlin or Fort Mill, it'll be within a 3E factor of the reference that they're aiming for. Now, some web to print printers out there where you send data online and you have them print it for you and send it back. Some of those are our customers, and they live with an E factor more around a 7. Because if you're going to send something over the internet and get it back, a day or two later, chances are you're not caring a ton about quality. So as long as it's in the ballpark, it's probably going to be okay. And that's again where these different levels of quality come in. Now, when we're working with a printing device, we need to understand what the characteristics are of that printing device in terms of what causes it to change the way it renders color. Some devices are susceptible to temperature and humidity differences. all devices are susceptible to differences in substrates and different inks and different toners. So this is where you need to baseline your devices and understand what the repeatability is of these devices over time, so that you can define how often you need to recalibrate the device to bring it back to a known and reproducible condition. And this is where you use conformance software. Conformance software that quantifies the difference in E factor based on the device capabilities. And then if the E factor of the device is lower than your expectations, you're good. If it's higher, then you need to do some more process control to get that device under control. And we'll talk about that here, in that, like, depending upon your target level of performance, you need to relate that to your expectations. So if you're using an old printed ruler, like I'm showing on the left, your expectations probably aren't very tight, as opposed to the micrometer on the right. And we can quantify this in E factor. So you're not very accurate when you're measuring distance with the instrument on the left, but you're very accurate when you're measuring distance with the instrument on the right. And in the same way, when we look at how a device is performing in terms of printing the same colors over time, think of on the left with the bullseye target, each of these red dots represents how this printer is printing over time. And it's not very consistent. The E factor is a 7, where the printer on the right, the cluster of dots is much tighter. That E factor is a 3. So each printer, each measurement device, each expectation is different. And what we do is we merge these together. So if your expectations are a 6 and your device is a 3, you have success. It will meet your expectations. But if your expectations are a 2 and your device is anything more than a 2, even a 3, then you've got failure, meaning you've either got to reset your expectations, or you've got to apply a higher level of calibration and process control to your device to get the E factor of the device less than a 3, ideally down to less than a 2, because that's what your expectations are. That helps you understand how often you need to recalibrate. And in this way, you print your standard target over multiple days, over multiple weeks, and then quantify what's the difference of the print from Monday to Tuesday. And here we're showing this is a real life situation, an E factor of a 5. And then the difference from Tuesday to Wednesday is an E factor of a 7. And then the difference from Wednesday to Thursday is an E factor of 5. Well, if you're like 50% of the people out there, this is unacceptable. If I came in to a shop and had a job printed on Monday, and then I needed some reprints done on Tuesday, and I had that level of color difference, I would not be accepting that color. And I'm not even that, not that picky about my color, but I would not accept that. I'm at that 50% level of what I expect in terms of a color match. And then you need to look at your whole workflow, because all of your devices that you use to work with color should be calibrated. So your printing devices should be calibrated. Most printing devices now have built-in calibration that come with the digital device. Measurement devices, every measurement device should be calibrated and calibrated regularly and checked regularly to make sure it's measuring the way it's expected to be. Plate setters should be calibrated to know that they're printing over time. And then conventional presses, like offset presses, they should be calibrated regularly to continually hit, let's say, a G7 condition. And I know a lot of companies just print their target once every year, and they know that over the course of the year, the device moves off a G7 condition, but they've only allowed for a calibration once a year because it costs so much money to take a conventional press like an offset press do a dedicated press run and do plate curves, it could be $5,000 per substrate per press. And what we've done is we've done away with that. Most of our customers never do a dedicated press run. We've formulated the ability to do G7 targets in a very small area that can be put in line with actual live jobs, so that you never have to do a dedicated press run again on a conventional press to get it into a G7 condition. It can be done real time with live work, but we'll talk about that at a later session in more detail. So when we're talking about calibration, is all required for consistency. The better calibration is, the more precise the printer is. And this gets down to understanding what normal printer variation is, because different printers vary color for different reasons. And so we'll talk about some of these reasons here, and we'll talk about some of the variation that we've seen out there. There's three main types of variation. The first is within page variation or within sheet. So it's, if you're printing a label, you want to make sure the label in the upper left-hand corner matches the other corners. And checking this variation is important, because I've seen printers, all shapes and sizes, be very inconsistent in terms of how they print on different corners of the sheet. And if you think you have a large format inkjet, and that's okay with this, that's not. I've seen situations. I was working with a top customer at one point, went into their Vegas plant during a show, and they were having trouble profiling their press. And I said, well, have you checked the variation on this printer? And they said, no. And we printed the same target on all four corners and measured them and compared them, and the E factor difference was 8. And it's like, if you build a profile for the left corner versus the right corner, that's an 8 E factor difference. The color's not going to match. And they're like, oh my goodness, we didn't even think about checking the variation of the printer on the flatbed. And part of the reason was the head was at different levels. The carriage was not set properly, so the head was different levels on one side of the sheet versus the other side of the sheet. Well, once we figured this out, first time they built the profile, it worked like a charm. But because they weren't checking the variation, they didn't know. Between page repeatability is another type of variation. There's certain printers that I've seen that between the first sheet and the 50th sheet, it changes by 2 to 3 E factor. And that it's like a warm-up period. And that's a digital device. We're not talking a typical sheet fed press, which you have to allow at least 50 to 100 sheets to get that press up and running. But we're talking a digital sheet. And so I was telling this company that their tolerance was a 2, that they were going to have to throw away the first 50 sheets. And they were like, are you kidding me? It's a digital. I shouldn't have to throw away any sheets. I'm like, don't shoot the messenger. This printer has a warm-up period, and it takes some time to get through it. And they were like, oh my goodness. New revelation for them. And then of course we've got between job reproducibility, meaning when you print a job on Tuesday, doesn't match the same job printed on Friday, and knowing that that's good. And typically these are all things I test before I even think about building a G7 curve or building an ICC profile for a given printer and printer process. So by doing this, we can figure out what affects the printer's consistency, and then we can address normal variation for different technologies. So here I'm showing our VI816 target. It's a target that we use to assess the within page uniformity, and it helps us see what's going on that device. We can also use it. We have it in a form of 1,000 sheet press run. So you print this 1,000 sheets, pull out every 50 sheets, measure it, and then we can see in this case an actual example where you see how that magenta line starts at a 0, and at the 1 mark it pops up to a 2E factor. This is a situation where this printer changed 2 delta E over the first 50 sheets. And if you're wondering, if you've got a new press or you're wondering how your presses are performing, we have some PDFs that we can provide you with instructions on how to print them, when to print them, how to measure them, so you can start quantifying these differences to understand exactly what's happening on your printers. And I want to mention here, people often say, well, yeah, every printer is different, or there's color differences, but you should always average your data. And what I'll say to that is, no, you should check your data first and make sure all the data is relevant to one another, and calculate what the peak delta E is and the average delta E is before you average the data. Because if I was, let's say, trying to average the data of this Ritz box, and I accidentally measured a place that has a vignette on it, by measuring that vignette and averaging it with the true brand color, my whole brand value is going to be thrown off. It's going to be wrecked. So don't blindly average data. You want to look at your data. You want to compare what the differences are, see what your E factor is, and if that's acceptable, then average the data. Don't blindly average. That's a mistake too many people make. So when we go back as a summary to how to quantify printer variation, need to understand what types of printer variation and how to check them, need to understand what affects printer variation, need to define a metric that helps you define the consistency, which, as we've talked about, E factor is a really good metric for this, and how to monitor your print consistency over time. And doing monitoring your print consistency over time is all about color conformance, which is that 5th C in the 5 C's that we talk about. Now, when we're talking about what types of calibration procedures are available to us, we have multiple. So if we're dealing with a, let's say a conventional or a digital type press, oftentimes the digital presses have the calibration built into that printing device or built into the RIP that came with that printing device. Now, when we're dealing with more conventional technologies like flexographic or sheet fed offset printing, this is where like a G7 calibration methodology or TVI methodology comes into play to calibrate those devices to make them consistent. Now, when to use which methodology? Typically, when we're dealing with traditional print processes, we use, make sure the processes such as the plate setter and the printing process is consistent and calibrated, and then use either a G7 calibration methodology or in some cases a TVI calibration methodology to get the device into a consistent and a shared visual appearance to my reference. And typically when we're calibrating our offset presses using G7, we can expect an E factor of about a 4 to 6 E factor to grackle. We can get a better match if we build an ICC profile for that process, but that's a lot more work, a lot more energy. You have to control all the processes on that print process if you even want to think about going that route. Now, when we're dealing with digital, like I said, most digital presses have the RIP has calibration built in, and it gives processes to use an instrument to calibrate the printer. And in most cases with digital, I don't take the effort to build a G7 curve. If the device after calibration is good enough, I might not need to do anything else. Sometimes I do need a tighter level of accuracy to, let's say, my grackle reference. And in that case, I might take the time to build an ICC profile for that printer right after the device is calibrated. Again, this is a a shortcoming that a lot of people don't think about. The printer that you're working with might be calibrated every morning at 8 in the morning. But this day you had stuff to do before you could go profile it. Now it's noon before you get around to printing out the profile target. Well, you've given that printer 4 hours to drift from its calibrated state. So if you think about it, the device is here at 8 o'clock in the morning, and at noon it might have moved over here. And now you profile it at noon, and then the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, it's recalibrated, and the profile is no longer valid. So it's really important to output your profile target right after you calibrate your printer to know that you're in line with that reproducibility aspect of that printing device. Now, here's a real example that I was sharing with you of this printer that I was looking at in just a couple miles from where I'm at right now. And you can see that I started measuring this printer on April 3rd. My last measurement was April 10th, or the last print was April 10th. And this is compared to Grackle. And you can see the E factor of this printer is between 4.5 and 5.7, 4.1 to Grackle. So it's actually a pretty good match to the Grackle reference condition. And if you look at the G7 column here, the column with the G7, you'll see there's check boxes and X's. And about half the prints are G7 compliant. And yet this printer was never G7. This is out of the box, calibrated to itself, and it's actually matching Grackle really well, and it's really close to being G7 compliant, meaning about 50% of the time it's G7, 50% it's not. But the 50% it's not, you see it's not changing the color quality. The color quality is very reasonable all the way through. You're not going to see the difference between a 4.4 E factor and a 4.6 E factor. The 4.4 happens to be passing G7, the 4.6 doesn't, but visually it's so close, it's passing G7. Don't submit it to Ideal Alliance because technically it's not, but from a sellability standpoint, you're going to sell every one of these sheets. And then if you look at the line here, the top line is showing you the accuracy of how close this is to Grackle, and that green line shows us the limit. And so this printer is below the limit. It's within my expectations. Now, the red line is showing the compared to the baseline. So back on April 3rd, when I first started measuring this, I said, make this my baseline. And now what I'm doing is I'm comparing not only how close this printer is printing to Grackle, but I'm comparing how consistent the printer is printing to itself. So that red line there is comparing how consistent the printer is printing it to itself day after day. And this is incredibly valuable because if you were to build a profile, or a G7 curve, you want to build a baseline for that device when that's built. So not only can you track how close the device is hitting your reference, but you can track how consistent the device is to itself, because every device drifts, whether it's lack of changing consumables or what have you, it drifts. And there is a point where you will need to update that G7 curve or build a new ICC profile. And this line will help tell you that. If that line starts getting up close to that green line, which is your goal, that's a warning sign saying, hey, it's time to reprofile or recalibrate my printer. The blue line that you see here is automatically checking the within sheet variation, because the target that I'm using actually has repeated identical patch values. And when I import this into my conformance software, which in this case happens to be ChromaChecker, it's telling me how consistent the print is to itself. So you can see the measurement number 2, it kind of spiked up here. There was a fair amount of inconsistency on that page, but the printer recovered, probably maintenance was done on it, and it straightened itself out. So no need to worry. So this is what we're talking about: baselining a printer, understanding the characteristics. And in this case, this printer, in the way it's being used, it's averaging probably a 4.5 E factor. And as I shared with you, if you're under 5, more than 50% of the people will accept it. And for how this is being used, it's good enough. Nothing else has to be done with it. Now, can I make this printer better? Absolutely. If you look at the cyan magenta yellow icon and the red green blue icon, those are all X's. I know based on the gamut of this device that I could profile this printer, aim it for grackle, and instead of a 4.5, I could probably easily get a 2.5 E factor. But again, for the customers that are using this printer, they don't care about a 4.5 versus a 2.5. This is actually a printer you can walk in and print at a corner print shop. So they're not looking for a 2.5. They're not Ritz. They're not having Ritz printed on this printer. So in this case, calibration is really all that's necessary to color control this printer to meet expectations. Now, they should still be checking it so that if the corona wire goes off on it one time and the printer pops to an 8 E factor, that they can get on it immediately, fix it before too many jobs have been printed on it, which causes exposure for loss and loss of profitability. So this is a situation where even though everything's going well, you still want to check it routinely to make sure that printer is making sellable color. So,
Dave,
yeah.
we have a question in the chat from
Yes.
David. Should we be calibrating our digital devices separately on each substrate?
Oh, great question. Typically, most digital devices, if you calibrate on one substrate, it's good enough. Because what you're really doing is you're telling the printer how it's printing and resetting it to that known and reproducible state. And as long as you do it on that same substrate every day and the printer gets back to that condition, you should be okay. Now, I'm saying most printers. There are some technologies of printers where you do need to calibrate on different on the specific substrate, but most printers you don't have to. Okay, if you want, you can put in the chat what printer it is, and we can talk offline about whether or not you have one of those printers where you should calibrate every substrate.
And also feel free to unmute yourselves. Everybody is muted currently, but feel free to unmute and converse.
Yeah, please. So when to use what methodology, as we talked about, optional G7 calibration methodology. If expectations are pleasing color, then yeah, you might benefit from G7. If we take like a HP Indigo press, and if we just run it in a native mode, it's usually about a 6 to 7 to grackle. But if we apply a G7 curve to it, we get it down to maybe a 5 to grackle. But if we profile it, we'll get it down to a sub 3 to grackle. And again, each step takes more energy, more time, gives you a higher quality, gives you a lower E factor, but it's not for free. It's a trade-off. And as we talked about, you don't always need to make a profile. Sometimes you'll want to for a higher quality. And that's what our next session is going to be on next month, about how to make an ICC profile, what your options are. This session is all about calibration and deciding whether or not you need to make a G7 profile. So in summary, color control starts with calibrating all your devices, your instruments, your monitors, your printers, everything. And expectations determine how much and what type of process control you need. Every type of device should be calibrated. And there's different methods to quantify variation to help build calibration schedules. And we're going to leave you with a methodology to do this. You'll see it in the next slide. But we have a physical target that looks like this. It has images on it, and it has a CC84 color bar on it. And what it allows you to do is print this target on each of your printing devices. And if you want, you can print it on each of your printing devices every day or every other day. And then you measure this target with the trial software that we're providing you. And it will show you in eFactor how much your device moves over a daily process. So you'll start understanding how consistent each of your printing processes are with or without calibration, with or without color management. And the beauty of this is you can start comparing printers to one another. So you can compare how printer A is printing next to printer B in a numeric number. So if printer A is printing to printer B to a 2, you'll know, oh, they're really close to one another. But if printer A is printing to printer B at an 8, you don't want to be sharing work between those two printers. So this is what we're going to leave you with, is this call to action to go to ChromaChecker.com/trial. And there's all the steps and procedures for downloading this PDF, printing it on your different devices, measuring it using our capture trial software, which I'm going to show in a minute here. And then it will tell you where your device is at. In fact, capture will actually build a new G7 correction curve or even an ICC profile to bring your device back into line should it need it. So I encourage all of you to go to the ChromaChecker.com/trial, download this file, and it will give you a link to capture. And I'm popping into capture right now. And when you log in, you'll log in using your sample login criteria. And then we'll be giving you a the default color bar will be the CC84 color bar, which is a G7 calibration bar. And what I'll do is I'll choose the device that I'm working with. So I'll say I'm working with my color press. And I'm going to now just quickly measure this color bar. So you'll see I've got my I1 here. I've got my my guide. I've got my my marks on the guide, so I know where to line it up on my color target. And we'll just quickly go ahead. Any questions while I'm measuring this?
And also, please take a look at your chat box. You will find the link to the form for feedback. Please fill it out so that we and send it back so that we have your feedback.
So I've measured 2 rows. I'm measuring left to right, right to left, now back right to left, left to right. Here we go. And now up on the message comes a 9.3 E-factor. I'm looking for a 6. It's a 9.3. It's quite a bit off of what my expectations are. So this is probably going to be a problem. Although if I look here, my paper's off by 5.6. So I didn't put a fail criteria on my paper, but I could have. But since the paper's off by 5, remember paper's at 5th color in 4-color printing. Since paper's off by 5.5 E-factor or delta E, it's no wonder the print's off by 9. I can see the print is G7 compliant, but if it were not, I could actually come here to the G7 button, click on it, and it brings up my G7 curve and allows me to go ahead and say calculate, and ChromaChecker will build a new correction curve for this process, actually download it to my computer as a format relative to my workflow. So if it's Caldera, it'll save a text file. If it's EFI, it'll save a VCC. If it's HP, it'll save a LUT. So you can pre-configure all of that. And then going in my timeline, I can see, oh, look at this, guys. I have a problem. You can see over months, the printer was printing great. And then lately, it's just been skyrocketing. So it's gone from 4 to 5 to 6 to 9. So this tells me it's time for me to do some maintenance on my printer, that the device is drifted well beyond its expectations. As we talked about, 9 is the point where no one's going to accept the color from this. And you can see my baseline of this has moved dramatically. So this device is in need of repair, this printer. And I know that now, there's no doubt. So with your trial, you'll be able to print this type of target. You'll be able to measure them in. You'll be able to compare them. And I see there's some other questions on the chat.
There's a question. Would that curve only be valid for that job?
No, it should be valid for that print process. So that substrate, that printer, that curve should be valid for that print process based on its tendency to drift or change, right? So as long as you've got that device in a calibrated state, and you know it's calibrated, then that curve should be good to go for as long as that device doesn't drift. Let me go to the cloud quick just to show you what this looks like on the cloud. So if I go to my login and I go to my print inspectors, you'll see I have different printers. And here's the color press I just measured the data into. You can see 9.3 E factor, 5.6 is the substrate difference. And if I wanted to compare how my color press 1 is now printing to my color press 2, which is at a 5.3 E factor, I could just click on both these print processes, say compare, say the last measurement, and it shows me that the bullseye's grackle, that color press 1 is 5.9 off of the bullseye, color press 2 is 5.3 off of the bullseye, but to one another, they are 7.4 E factor difference. So I wouldn't want to be running any jobs, the same job on both these printers. It would be a problem. But now look what ChromaChecker is telling me. The difference between the substrates of these two printers is 7 delta E. Papers at 5th color and 4 color printing. So to get a better match, we recommend using the same substrate on both devices, and if not possible, use the substrate inspector to find a closer match. And we've got a tool that helps you find substrates that match closer if you can't use the same substrate. So right here, we've troubleshooted why these two printers are not matching one another. And my estimate is that if we were to use the same paper on both these printers, the printers would be much closer together, hopefully within a 2 E factor of one another. And we wouldn't have any problem whatsoever. So this is all about troubleshooting color issues, understanding when printers aren't printing right, and knowing what to do about it to get the printers back to their known and reproducible state. That's all the content I had for everyone. Anyone have any other questions?
Yes, and while you're thinking about that, please check your chat and click the link, fill out the form for feedback to help guide us in what you'd like to see in future Second Tuesday webinars.
You know, the last thing I'll show you since we're here is we talked about averaging data and measuring data. I'm in the scratchpad area of ChromaChecker right now. And if I had a project like that Ritz box project, let me just show you how quick this is. I'm going to take my Ritz box here and I'm going to measure the red on this Ritz box. So if you look at the camera, you can see I'm measuring this red on the Ritz box, and up it comes and it says, oh yeah, it's passing Ritz red at a 2.0 E factor. Now, that's cool. I love that. Now, if I go into start variation and I start measuring around this Ritz box, I'm going to see how consistent this red is in different places on this box. So as I keep measuring, it's automatically taking spectral values and measuring and comparing the differences. And you can see I've got 6 samples, 15 pairs of colors. The E factor is 1.08. And if I accidentally measure an area where I shouldn't, immediately you'll see that. And you'll see, uh-oh, this measurement here, which is measurement 9, And that measurement there, which is measurement 9, is very different. And what I did was I did measure off of the true Ritz red. I measured on the vignette. And so if I were to average the data now, this average would be poor representation of what I really want. But because I can isolate 9 as being a bad actor, I can just go ahead and get rid of 9. And now this variation 502 is the spectral variation of these 8 samples, which has very good uniformity. And then I can use that as a sample to show Ritz that I'm hitting my colors. And because I measured them in a quadrant area, I'm giving Ritz a uniformity report showing that, hey, I'm within your tolerance, and I'm within your tolerance around the area of the box. So not only am I hitting the right color, but I'm consistently hitting the right color around the area that you've asked me to. So these are some new capabilities that we've added within Capture, which you will be able to use if you download the trial and take advantage of our offer to show you how to check your color over time to understand color variation and how often you need to calibrate. So I hope you enjoyed it. And everyone have a good week, and feel free to reach out with emails or voicemails if you want to talk to us about more information or more questions.
Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you ahead of time for filling out the feedback form. We really appreciate it. Have a nice day.